Pitun's Last Stand, an entertainment about the fall of Russia by Alexander Motyl. Chapter 1, Moscow. I still can't decide what was more remarkable, to have seen Russia in ruins or to have met its former master in the Riviera. Both experiences were quite unexpected, at least as far as I was concerned, but not unconnected. The former made the latter possible, though serendipity made it, like so many other things in life, and in particular in my life, inevitable. The wars that devastated Vladimir Pitun's miserable land also catapulted the tyrant, who had in no small measure contributed to that misery, into the warm climes of southern France, where his path crossed mine. But I'm running ahead of myself, for the story of my acquaintance with the great Vladimir Vladimirovich Pitun begins not in the lovely city of Nice, and not on its bustling Promenade des Anglais, but in New York, where I live and work for a major newspaper whose name will go unmentioned, but whose reputation is stolid, and whose largesse is the envy of poor, unrecognized scribblers the world over. I was supposed to go to Moscow to cover a summit of major oil and gas-producing nations. The former Soviet Union is my beat, and although my net editor never fails to try to flatter me by paying obeisance to my supposed expertise, he also never fails to send me on missions to obscure parts of the globe on the rationale that anyone who can make sense of the incomprehensible Russians and their incomprehensible soul can make sense of anything. My actual expertise falls far short of such insights, but since both knowledge and ignorance can be equally great sources of power, I have yet to tell him of his misconceptions. And then serendipity intervened. 2 days before my planned departure for the Russian capital, Pitun, claiming that the human rights of Russian speakers were being violated in northeastern Estonia, and invoking a doctrine he had first formulated in his 2014 war against Ukraine, invaded the little country. Naturally, the Russians never used the word invasion. Instead, they insisted they were forced to heed the appeals of a heretofore unknown Russian Democratic Front, which, as the legitimate representative body of Estonia's allegedly downtrodden Russian minority, called on Moscow to rush to its assistance lest their pristine democratic aspirations be crushed by Estonian boots. What else could the democratically inclined peace lover par excellence, Vladimir Vladimirovich Pitun, do but reluctantly send in the tanks and mobilize the Air Force? "Forget Moscow, Steve," my crusty editor snarled. "Go to Estonia and cover the war." So I did, especially as I fully expected the escapade to be over in a few days. The Estonian army was minuscule, and notwithstanding its unquestioned heroism and dedication to the homeland, a few thousand Estonians were no match for several 100,000 well-armed Russian soldiers, who, given what I knew about Pitun's love of adventurism, a character trait that I personally ascribed to his diminutive size and the Napoleon complex it engendered, were likely to move from Estonia to Latvia and Lithuania, thereby encircling Belarus and Ukraine and presenting the terrified Europeans and their hapless NATO officials with a fait accompli. I figured that the Russians would finish occupying Tallinn airport at just about the time of my arrival. That would make for a great lead sentence, though how I'd continue the story was rather less clear, since it was perfectly possible that the Russians would keep me under lock and key in some god-forsaken terminal with nothing but warm beer and stale peanuts for an extended period of time. Something would fall into place. I know enough about the world to know it always does. When I arrived in Tallinn, to my surprise, the airport was still in Estonian hands. More than that, things were normal. There was no hint of panic, no rumors of impending Russian conquest, no preparations for evacuation. As our Estonian stringer and go-to guy, Andrus, told me on our way to the capital city, his English is probably better than that of most Americans. The reason for the normalcy was shockingly simple, and as unexpected by the Estonians as it was welcome to them. While I was in the air, cramped between two foul-smelling and completely inebriated Finnish businessmen in economy class, what began as a seemingly invincible Russian incursion had morphed into a full-fledged war, but not between Russia and Estonia, as the Russians had hoped, but between Russia and most of her neighbors, as they had not expected. More amazingly still, the neighbors gleefully stabbed the Russians in their back, were now on the offensive, and appeared to be winning. Apparently, Andrus continued, while exceeding the speed limit in his sleek silver gray Mercedes and flaunting his superiority by passing every car that dared to dawdle in front of us, Russia's attack on Estonia had served as a signal to all its disgruntled minorities and equally disgruntled neighbors, the former fed up with Moscow's overbearing indifference to their national rights, the latter fed up with Moscow's imperial aspirations, to hit back. Unsurprisingly, the Chechens struck first, taking advantage of the Kremlin's focus on the Baltic to detonate a powerful bomb at the foot of the Kremlin's high walls, at just the place where the Soviet and Russian dignitaries are interred, and tearing open a huge hole in the bricks. The damage could easily be repaired, except of course for the graves, which were demolished, but the symbolism could not be undone. If the Kremlin was vulnerable, then so too was all of Russia. I was surely no less surprised by this daring act than the lugubrious inhabitants of the awful Kremlin. No less remarkable, considering that all this took place while I was inhaling alcohol-laden air in a plane, there followed in swift succession a series of assassinations of Russian officials, mayors, governors, military men, in Ingushetia, Dagestan, Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, and Sakha-Yakutia. In the North Caucasus and the Siberian taiga, bands of well-armed local guerrillas launched attacks on Russian police and military units, usually inflicting high casualties and mutilating the corpses, presumably as warnings to the civilian Russian population. Andrus, who knew these things far better than I did, suggested that the attacks must have been planned and coordinated well in advance of their actual execution. Yes, I agreed. These minorities must have spent months acquiring weapons and strategizing while waiting for an appropriate time to strike. It was no wonder that Pitun's hordes had stopped well short of the gates of Tallinn. He had a crisis of major proportions to deal with, in comparison to which Estonia was small fry. The story, the real story, was now in Moscow. I decided to stay in Tallinn for a day or two and produce one byline to keep my editor happy. Then I'd have to make my way to the Russian capital. The planes and trains weren't running reliably, so that meant going by car. Always on the lookout for freelance work that paid dollars, the entrepreneurial Andrus, whose portly, bald, and middle-aged appearance belied the energy and dedication to his craft that he had manifested during every one of my junkets to the former USSR, volunteered his vehicle and his services, and after placing a 10-gallon container of gas in the trunk and stocking up on sandwiches, soda, and energy bars, we set off at midnight. When my eyes first alighted on the battered old Zaporozhets, the erstwhile pride of the Soviet automobile industry that would convey us to Moscow, I expressed disappointment and surprise that we wouldn't be taking his Mercedes. Will this heap make it there and back? I wondered out loud. But Andrus reassured me that appearances could be deceptive. The motor had been refitted, and the jalopy, he actually used that word, would not only make it, but also refrain from tempting car thieves, in contrast to the shiny new Mercedes. Believe me, Stephen, he said, it'd be gone in a day and we'd have to walk back. Andrus knew the back roads, and a few hours after leaving Tallinn, we approached a border crossing south of Lake Pskov. He had decided to avoid Narva, which was likely to be heavily guarded by both the invading Russian forces and their local collaborators, manned by two sleepy Russian soldiers in rumpled olive drab uniforms. Highly unusual, Andrus whispered. The crossing is never so poorly guarded. They must, he surmised, have been withdrawn to other parts of the country. Is that a good sign? I asked naively. He nodded, though his broad grin betrayed the elation he was feeling. Estonians, I didn't have to remind myself, did not suffer from a surfeit of affection for their elder Russian brother. One of the guards, a pimply boy with red cheeks, thick glasses, and absurdly magnified bright blue eyes, demanded to see our papers. I showed him my press pass, a fake one that had identified me as a correspondent for the Moscow-funded RTV television station, and evidently ignorant of the concept of a non sequitur, he wanted to know what the purpose of our visit was. I pointed to the past, told him, in good Russian no less, I was a correspondent for RTV, and upon seeing that he received this information with a quizzical look on his flat face, explained that we were pro-Russian and funded by Russia, and that I had to get to Moscow as soon as possible to tell the world the truth about what was transpiring in Mother Russia. His pal, who stank of moonshine, Samogon, nudged him with his elbow and grunted, «Не пизди, Сережа, я устал и хочу выпить». Having been instructed not to fuck around because his comrade was tired and wanted a drink, pimply-faced Seryoja stamped our passports, smiled uneasily, and waved us through with «Всё хорошо», all is well, «Всё хорошо». The roads were surprisingly deserted. Oddly enough, most of the traffic was going westward, the importance of which fact I came to appreciate only later, and some 10 hours later we arrived in Moscow. I proposed we take lodgings in a cheap hotel in the main drag, the Arbat. I knew the owner, a swarthy Armenian who fit the stereotype of swarthy Armenians, from previous visits, and appreciated the unpretentious and clean rooms and the goat cheese, olives, and flatbread served at breakfast. But Andrus shrugged his shoulders and said he had a better idea. The oversized apartment of a friend of his, one Igor Ivanovich Potapov, located in one of the back streets of the centrally placed Kitaygorod district. Potapov, Andrus assured me, was utterly reliable, and better still, he was a great enemy of the regime. He would keep his mouth shut, and being a native of the city and a former secret police officer, would be able to direct us to places that were otherwise inaccessible and to meet people who would not normally be inclined to talk to dastardly inostranцы or foreigners like us. Besides, we had no choice but to go to Potapov's, as Andrus had called him from Tallinn and arranged for our stay. You'll see, he said, we'll be quite comfortable. Do you still remember how to drink Russian style? He added slyly. Potapov's flat, as the thick-necked muscular Russian called it in his serviceable English, was a dilapidated affair that had seen few dusters and mops since his wife died over 20 years ago. Judging from a framed photograph that stood on a sacking bookshelf, I decided that Potapova must have been a formidable woman. Big-chested, hair drawn back in a tight bun, a scowl masquerading as a smile on her elongated face. Definitely no Miss Havisham, which may have explained why Potapov did not appear to be touched by even a hint of mourning. Instead, he greeted us with a toothless smile. He later removed his dentures from a murky glass next to the liquor cabinet and placed them in his mouth with a resolute pop, and a bottle of cold vodka. The table was set for three. A basket of thickly cut rye bread stood in the middle, surrounded by small plates of sliced raw onions, cucumbers, marinated tomatoes, grayish sardines swimming in some oily yellow substance, and a C-shaped sausage with enormous chunks of fat just visible below the surface of the casing. Several bottles of beer and Fanta completed the ensemble. It felt like the Soviet Union again. We took our seats. Potapov poured the vodka into stained tea glasses, cried "Na zdrovye," and after emitting a groan that hovered somewhere between delight and ecstasy, took a bite of onion, poured himself a beer chaser, and bellowed, "Welcome to Russia." He downed the beer and wiped his mustache, a brush-like accoutrement that covered his upper lip, and taken together with his soulful eyes, gave him the appearance of a tired walrus. And looking at me, and then at Andrus, and then again at me, said, "So, comrades, how can I be helping you?" "For starters," I replied, "what the hell is going on here? First there is the Estonian business, and now assassinations, ambushes." Andrus and Potapov watched as I poured myself a Fanta and bit into a cucumber. "I mean, who's in charge? And why the hell isn't Pitun doing anything about it? He's president, after all." The questions, I realized too late, were naive and would hardly inspire Potapov's confidence in my abilities. Potapov reciprocated with a crooked smile as if he were an exasperated schoolteacher dealing with the class dunce. He filled our glasses, proposed that we drink to peace and understanding, and sat back. While I wondered whether his invocation of Soviet toasts was a stab at irony on his part or a mark of nostalgia for the good old days, he broke off a piece of sausage, shoved it into his mouth with a satisfied grunt, and his eyes glistening with alcoholic cheer, pointed a greasy finger at me. "He funny guy, Andrus. He one funny guy." Suspecting that an explanation delivered in broken English would be too much for my impatient ears, I repeated my questions in Russian and hoped he would take the hint and reply likewise. He did. "You must understand," he began, "that the great Pitun is not so great. You Western journalists and so-called experts think of him as a masterful chess player." He turned to Andrus. "Don't you always say that, while Pitun is playing chess, you are playing checkers?" Potapov sniggered sardonically as Andrus nodded. "You are wrong, my friend, so very, very wrong." Potapov was staring at me now. "Pitun is an amateur, a little boy in shorts. He happened to be in the right place at the right time. You remember the 1990s? Russia was collapsing, our president was a drunk, and Pitun mounts a big white stallion and rides into the city, promising law and order and greatness at precisely the time that—" "Energy prices went through the roof," I interjected, hoping to redeem my battered image as an expert. "Exactly," cried Potapov. "Tochno. We Russians wanted a Tsar, and Pitun gave us a Tsar." Potapov stroked his mustache and looked around the room distractedly before breaking off another piece of sausage. I watched 2 bits of fat bounce off his plate and fall to the floor. "And he gave them one more thing, a feeling of greatness. Don't look so surprised, my dear Andrusha. We Russians need to believe we are great. It doesn't matter whether we are. After all, the country is a toilet and everyone knows that. But—" Potapov carefully placed a slice of sausage and a piece of bread and pushed the contraption into his mouth. "We must believe that there is no other toilet like ours in the world." Potapov swung his arms majestically in a great arc. He lowered them like a dying swan in Tchaikovsky's ballet and concluded with operatic finality. Pitun has been lucky. His luck ran out years ago, but you Americans were too stupid to see that. And now he looked me straight in the eyes while I resisted the temptation to turn away. And now Pitun is paying the price for his stupidity and negligence, especially during the coronavirus crisis. We survived that, barely, with no thanks to the great Pitun. Potapov's eyebrows rose, creasing his aged forehead and creating the impression that he was speaking of something that concerned him not a whit, and he shrugged. And now it is the end. Koniec. For Pitun, obviously, but he no longer matters. His eyes appeared to well up with tears. My friends, it is the end of Russia. Potapov laid both hands on the table and leaned forward, his wet lips quivering. This is just the beginning. These assassinations, these attacks. Soon, very soon, maybe even tomorrow, there will be war. We have made everyone hate us, and now we will have to pay the price. He wiped his eyes and reached for the bottle. There is no escaping fate, my friends. Are you fatalists? Perhaps we should all be. But first, let us drink. What else is there to do when your world, your home, your life is about to collapse? I suspected that Potapov was, in typically melodramatic Russian fashion, overstating the case. But my tongue tied by his pessimism and my head blurry from the alcohol and lack of sleep, I said nothing. Andrus, who could have justifiably been expected to give in to temptation and gloat, also remained silent. The next day proved me wrong. With Moscow's attention diverted to Estonia and its rebellious provinces, Ukraine launched a full-scale offensive against the depleted Russian forces stationed in the Crimea and along Russia's border with the secessionist bits of the Donbass. The assassinations and guerrilla attacks, meanwhile, picked up steam, and scores more took place throughout the North Caucasus, the territories inhabited by the Volga Tatars, and a broad swath of Siberia in the Far East. Mutilations, severed noses, tongues, and occasionally genitalia now appeared to have become the norm throughout much of Russia. Leaflets written in broken Russian were also being distributed, warning local Russians to leave the non-Russian territories or face death. Panicky telephone calls clogged the airwaves as the inhabitants of St. Petersburg and Moscow frantically sought news of their friends and relatives scattered throughout the vast Russian Federation. Social media were rife with rumors of marauding, murderous, slant eyes, bloodthirsty fascists, nationalist cutthroats, genocidal maniacs, and other riffraff out to kill innocent Russians. I had no doubt that the growing chaos in Russia's provinces was bringing out the worst in the lumpen, but Potapov's views still ringing in my ears, I was absolutely certain that most of the attacks, though horrible to contemplate, were acts of vengeance for perceived and real wrongs committed by Pitun and his supporters, who, alas, were legion. For despite all his faults, despite his being a poor chess player and fool who hadn't understood that he should have stepped down years ago, the people, the simple narod, beloved of Russia's deluded 19th century poets and writers, admired and adored the man. It was the intelligentsia that despised him, although even they included not a few mercenaries willing to sacrifice their ideals and their calling for 30 pieces of silver. Pitun knew how to keep his people in line. He gave them bread. He gave them circuses in the form of his own macho antics, and he gave them a sense of pride in their own benighted selves. As Potapov said, Russia was, or had become a toilet, but it was supposedly the best toilet in the world. Unfortunately, Pitun had also deprived the Russians of any claim to innocence, and it was no surprise that many non-Russians interpreted the absence of innocence as the presence of guilt for the crimes against humanity that Pitun had committed, and that the Russians had countenanced, if not actively approved. There was no such thing as collective guilt. I knew that, but I also knew that if there were, it would apply wholeheartedly to the Russians Pitun had created. Spineless, drunk with greatness, and fanatically committed to a mad tyrant, they bore much of the moral responsibility for his actions. They were hated, and now they were paying for the hatred they had expressed and engendered. My ruminations, which had taken place as I drank some black tea and chewed on a piece of stale bread, were interrupted by a tremendous explosion. The three of us ran to the window and saw several delicate plumes of smoke rising from the direction of the Kremlin. I slipped into my jacket, ascertained that I had my pad and pen, grabbed my camera, ran my fingers through my hair, and accompanied by the equally disheveled Andrus, dashed through the door without saying adieu and bounded down the creaking stairs. The whole building was in uproar as a crowd of gesticulating and chattering Russians gathered outside. "Это, наверное, Kremlin," an unshaven man in soiled pajamas said. "It's probably the Kremlin." Andrus and I followed the streaming crowd and ran toward Red Square. Sirens blared, ambulances zigzagged among the cars, and pedestrians, policemen, and soldiers, their rifles in their hands and their guns cocked, rushed ahead, their exact destination unknown. As we reached the square, I realized that Potapov's neighbor had been wrong. The explosion hadn't rocked the Kremlin's high walls. That presumably would have been overkill, according to the Chechen masterminds behind the deed. Instead, the blast had destroyed one side of St. Basil's, the magnificent cathedral with the fabulous multicolored onion domes. We stopped, shocked by what we were witnessing, and as I readied my camera, we watched with horror as the rest of the edifice began crumbling in slow motion, almost as if we were watching an old film. And within a few seconds, perhaps no more than 10, the whole pile of bricks and icons came crashing down, sending up a colossal cloud of thick, pungent smoke. The crowd stopped moving, as everyone was transfixed by the unfolding tragedy. When the crash finally came, a deep groan emerged from the depths of their guts and took flight like a flock of crows. The dust slowly lifted, revealing a massive mound of debris among which lay curved parts of the domes and gleaming remnants of golden crosses. Hundreds of years of Russian culture had vanished in an instant. And then, frantically, the crossings and mumblings of prayers began, followed by the wailing, the tears, the kneeling and waving of arms. How could one not pity so pathetic a people? They may have supported and behaved like criminals. They may have willfully danced on the graves of foreign cultures. But even criminals, even mass murderers, can elicit pity when reduced to such desperate straits. I had no time to pursue that line of thought, however, as almost immediately after the cathedral had imploded, 2 more explosions shook Red Square. Lenin's mausoleum, so long the central adornment of the huge space that featured annual displays of Russia's military might, seemed to rise into the air, and then, as pieces of black marble flew in all directions, settled into a smoking heap with which whatever remained of Lenin's mummified body was presumably commingled. A fitting end, I thought, to the mass murderer who destroyed old Russia and replaced it with a monstrous experiment in human engineering that had killed millions and made Stalin inevitable. The second explosion. Or was it several simultaneous explosions, I couldn't tell, took place to our right. The delicate towers of the beautiful old GUM department store fell silently, while the vaulted glass roof exploded into millions of shards and rained down on the helpless masses below. The crowds which had rushed toward the GUM in order to escape the destruction of the cathedral and the mausoleum now reversed course and ran back to the center of the square. Colliding and falling bodies, screams and yells, and curses and prayers completing the picture of total mayhem. I had no doubt that all four explosions were the work of the Chechens. As I surveyed Red Square, I decided there would probably be no fifth, at least not here. The major architectural landmarks had been attacked or destroyed. The point had been made. The message was clear. Chechnya had declared war against Russia, and this time the war would be fought entirely on Russian and not Chechen lands. As we pivoted toward the Kremlin gates, a wail went through the crowd. Pitun, spasi nas, spasi nas, spasi nas. Would Pitun answer their entreaties and save them, I wondered. It was high time for the all-powerful dictator to make an appearance, reassure his people that all was well and that all would be well, and undertake some countermeasures. Instead, like Stalin after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Pitun appeared to be in hiding, as were his henchmen, the heads of the Secret Affairs Police, Internal Affairs Ministry, and National Guard, the top generals and his key financial backers among the so-called oligarchs. Were they planning a counterattack? Were they plotting to remove Pitun? I shared my suppositions with Andrus, and he agreed that something had to be afoot. Russians never just turned over and died. As it happened, that may have been true of the Russians, but not of Vladimir Vladimirovich Pitun and his buddies. For as we were speculating about what was really going on, Pitun and company were, as I learned a few hours later, boarding their private planes and fleeing the country.